started. First of all, I want to thank you guys for coming to the workshop today. We'll be going over React. So what we'll be doing is we'll be looking at some code base, kind of deciphering what that code is doing and understanding the logic behind the code, and then we're going to add some functionality to it. All right, so let's go ahead and begin. If you have any questions at all throughout, I cannot see the chat when I am sharing my screen. So just unmute yourself. I'm really casual and formal, so you can just unmute yourself, interrupt me, and ask away. All right, so we have this code right here. Can everyone see this all right?
Yep.
Awesome. All right. So if we look at this code, what can we tell is going on here? What is this code doing? What do we see on the screen? We see some functions. We see some import statements. We see a render function. Does anyone have an idea of what could be going on in this code right here? And I'll give you guys some time to look at it, of course.
It's a counter.
Okay, it's a counter. Okay, and what are we counting?
Up and down by 1.
Okay, so we have a counter and we are keeping track of that count. So we're keeping track of the state of a component, and we're updating that, okay? So good. So let's take a deeper look at the code. Now we have this high-level view of what's going on here. We are dealing with a counter, but oops. Let's take a deeper look. So here we are importing React from the React library, and then we're also importing Connect. Okay. Why would we be importing Connect? What do we use this for? Ace, are you about to say something? Does anyone have an idea why we're importing Connect? You see anywhere that we're using it?
In the export, connect map, state props, connect counter.
Exactly. So what we're doing here is we're connecting this function map state to props to this component counter, so that they can call on this function for this component, okay? And here, when we're doing that, that relates back to over here where we're looking at our store in our reducer function, okay? So the reason why is that here in our reducer function, now remember we call our reducer function when we create our store. And remember, our store is basically our tree state. Okay, so it's keeping track of the state of the component. So here in our reducer function, we have to make sure that we return an object. Okay, and that object has to have the prop count, which relates to the state's property of count, which is what we have here in our function map state to props here. So since we're returning this count with the value of state, the state's property of count, we have to make sure that we have an object that returns just like that. Are there any questions on what we're looking at, how the reducer works, why we have map state to props, why do we have a store? Anything here when we're creating our component?
I got a question. Is it easier to remember that you got to connect the functions on each page? Because the map state to props, the state is in a function and the reducer's in a function.
I'm not understanding your question. What do you mean, is it easier?
Is it easier to remember to connect the functions Because it's really
that's really dependent on, you know, what's easier for you to remember. So I'm not going to say one way is easier than another.
Is it true though?
Again, that depends on the developer and how you remember things. If you know that you need certain functions, kind of the best way to go about it is understanding how all of this connects and it works, which is why I'm going over what we're looking at here before we actually add any functionality to this. Why is this code written the way that it is, and why are we putting it in certain places here? So the reason, so you might remember the functions first, right? You know that you need to create a store because you need to keep track of your state tree, right? And in that, you use the create store function. Okay, so that's you have to remember you're using a function there. And you know that that function calls on another function, reducer. So if you you can connect all the functions together, and that might be the easiest way for you to go about it. So in answer to your question, yes, if that works for you, if you go through the logic, the functions just appear. And it's kind of easier to remember. Now, this is something that takes lots of practice. There's a lot of syntax going on here, but the most important thing is to understand how everything is working. And then you'll realize, okay, if I know that the reducer is a function, okay, I'm using this reducer function, and this I know has to return an object because of my function over here, map state to props, which uses our connect here that we imported. So everything kind of ties together, so you can kind of find that chain. So it's easier for you to know what you need to write next. Does that make sense? Did I confuse you more? Or
No, but it would be easier to remember because I barely passed this course, and like to know how it folds into itself, it was like a really difficult part because it's a circle, right?
right.
So I want to know what's first. What do I type up first, and then second, and then third, and then fourth?
Well, I guess the practice with that would be again, it's kind of just like how you go through the logic of things. But the best practice would be to go back through the walkthrough that's given in the curriculum, and it kind of goes through those steps one by one. So you'll start off with creating your components, and then in that you'll have, you know, what you're rendering onto the page. And then with that, it depends on what you're doing with that, right? Here we're creating a counter. So we created some button here. And we know that with these buttons on the click, it needs to trigger something, right? If I'm clicking the plus button, I need to trigger a function that indicates an increment. So if I need a function that indicates an increment, I know that I have to update that state, right? Because now the count went up 1. So if it started at 0, it's at 1. If it started at 15, it's at 16. So we know that we're dealing with state there. And if we're dealing with state, that means we probably need something to keep track of all those states as they're changing. So that's an introduction to bringing in the store. And with the store, and you use that create store function, you know that you are going to need a reducer. And then as you see me like mapping it through, so what I like to do is I like to talk it out loud as I'm doing with you guys right now to see, okay, these are the steps I need to take. And then as you're flowing through the logic of it, the code kind of begins to write itself. Now, it does take a lot of practice. Where do I put the parentheses? Where do I put the curly brackets? Do I put a semicolon here? Do I put a full colon there? Things like that just comes with practice. But saying it out loud, okay, this is what I want to do. That requires this, which then requires this. It's kind of like a domino effect, and then those steps appear. So there, I'm not going to say that, okay, first do this, second do this. You need to go through the logic of the problem that you're working with, because it could be different logic each time. Any comments on that? Any questions, concerns? If you do, please unmute yourself and just ask out loud. All right. So I'm going to assume that there are no questions on that. But if you do have any questions about the flow of what we're looking at, please ask. There's a lot of code that we can dissect here. And I want to make sure you guys have a real understanding, because when it comes to the final project, you're going to be given a code base that you're going to have to add to. So knowing what the code you're given is doing and knowing what you need to add to that is really an important skill. And it takes practice, and it takes asking questions, and it takes talking out loud. So with that being said, does anyone have any questions or comments?
I want to know if after this is over with, if we'll have access to review this again.
Yeah, so this is completely recorded, and it will be posted in your announcements. So you can go to your announcements on your dashboard, click Workshop Library, and it will be there. Or if you can't find it, you can always send me a message and I can send you a direct link. It will be posted by the end of today. The code that I'm working with is actually the Lesson 7 starter kit that you're given for your hands-on. So that's the code base I'm looking at. And this is something that you know, you will be doing a lot in the field as a junior developer. You'll be given some code and maybe you'll have to add some functionality to it or find what's wrong with it or something like that. So being able to decipher what's going on a code base is very important. So yeah, so let's go ahead and add some functionality to this. Before I do that, questions on what we just discussed as far as what's going on our screen? No? All right, so let's go ahead and add some functionality. Let's take a look at what it's doing right now. So if we take a look at what it's doing here, we're just keeping track of this state right here as we increment and decrement. Okay, so we're going up and down by 1. But let's say, and then we hit this reset button and it takes us back to our initial state of 0. Okay, so if we go back to code and we take a look at what's going on here, when I click the button, we have this dot decrement, which triggers this function here, right? And then it has this dot props dot dispatch. Now dispatch is used to trigger a change of state. Okay, so when there is a change of state, there is an action, and that action is decrement, but you need to give it a type. So here we wrote type decrement, and then in our reducer function, which goes with our create store, our state tree here, we have a switch case here, and we're looking at that action's type, okay? So the type in this situation here, when I hit that minus button, is decrement, right? So we're going back to our switch cases. If we go back to case here and we look at decrement, we're returning the current state minus 1. Okay, so let's say I wanted to add a button that adds by 10. Okay, I don't want to increment by 1, I want to increment by 10. What is the first thing we need to do? Or what could be the first thing we could do? Anybody? All right, well, one thing we could do is we could add our button, right? Let's have a button that says increment by 10. So I'm going to go here and add a button. Going to give it the attribute onClick. and it's going to be this dot increment 10. Okay. So if I do that, I need something to appear on my button, so I am going to write increment by 10. Okay. So here I'm calling on increment 10. That doesn't exist yet. So what I need to do is I need to add that here. Increment 10. And we're going to do this dot props dot dispatch. Okay. We're going to return it in object with the type. Oops. And I'll just call it increment 10. So that when we call our reducer function, it is going to have the type increment 10. So our action type is going to be increment 10. But we don't have a case here for increment 10. So I need to add that case. So I'll do case increment 10. It's going to, oops. It is going to return an object. It's going to have the property count, which is state.count plus what?
10.
10. Perfect. Not 190, 10. Okay, so now what we have done is we've created a button. Okay, we've added a function to our component here, and we have added a new case to our reducer function. Okay, so if we save everything here and we go back to our page, we increment by 10, we don't get it. Okay, so let's see what's going on here. Let's do, first thing I like to do is I'll inspect, go to my sources, and then I will do a hard reload. And then I will see if it works. So there, it does work here. So what happened is we refreshed, it didn't start working. So usually what I tend to think it is, my first thought is I didn't load our most updated version of code. So I'll open up my inspection tools, go to source, and then I'll do a hard reload. Okay. So we have an increment by 10 button here, and it's working and it's incrementing by 10. Now, if I wanted to decrement by 10, what would I need to do?
The same thing.
The same thing. Okay, so why don't you go ahead and tell me what that code would look like?
Pretty much do the same thing you just did, except that you're in decrement instead of increment.
Okay, but why don't you go ahead and just yep. Okay, so we're going to create a button. Okay, and what do I need to add here?
On click equals this increment or decrement minus, 10, or just decrement 10.
Yep. Awesome.
In the button description, decrement by 10.
Okay. Awesome. So we've created our button. Now what do we need to do?
In the class counter extends React component, add the decrement 10. Okay. 1 second.
Anyone want to take over for him?
Yeah, this dot props dot dispatch, and then your braces.
Okay.
And then a type. And that's decrement 10 too.
Okay.
I'm back.
Awesome.
Sorry about that.
No worries. We had Richard take over for you here. All right. So now we have added that to our counter component. What's our next step? Ace, you want to go? Oh, go ahead, Ethan. Go ahead. I think you said add a case, which is correct. So we're going to go ahead and add a case. Now we need to make sure our case matches the type that we've specified here. So we will do decrement 10. There we go. And then if that is the case, we want to return an object. So we do return. We're returning an object. It's going to have what property?
Count.
Count. And what is that property going to equal to?
State.count minus 10.
Perfect. All right. So let's go ahead and save this and refresh. Okay, so I'm going to do a hard reload because I don't even see my new button there. Okay, so we are adding by 10. We add by singles. We subtract by 10. And we got everything working here. So there we have added some functionality to some pre-existing code. So to recap kind of what I wanted to bring out of this workshop is really understanding the logic of the code that you're working with. What is written here, why is it written here, and how does this flow? So if we do need to modify something or add functionality to something, we kind of know where to do that and how to do that. So with that being said, are there any questions, concerns, feedback, anything on the workshop today?
How hard would it be to make a counter for visitors on a web page?
For visitors on a web page,
Yeah.
well, it would be something similar to this. You would have an initial state, and every time there was a visit, you would update that state. And then you would have to render that update similar to what we did here, except it's not going to be triggered by a button. It would be triggered by a site visit.
Okay.
Any other questions? In your, oh, is there a question? Okay. In your final project, you are given some code base and you do have to add functionality to it. So it's going to be something similar to this. It's going to be involve a little bit more detail. You'll have to write the reducer function. You'll have to write your own map state to props functions and things that kind of were already written in this part here. But what I want you to take from this and remember is the flow of your program, right? So if you go through the flow, you'll remember those are the things that you need to write. So that is my advice as you're going through it. Before you even start talking about code and what to write, go through the flow of the program. Are there any other questions before I wrap this up? I do want to thank you for joining me today. Everyone feeling good? Feeling all right?
Don't think I have any questions.
Awesome. Awesome. If you do have questions or if you want more one-on-one time and you want to explore something in greater detail, or
Hi,
if you
how's it going?
Good, how are you?
Oh, sorry.
Oh, it's okay. I got off track there. If you have any questions or if you need more one-on-one time, please send me a message and let me know, and we can make sure you get that support. Or if you want to look at something in more detail. Also, if you have any feedback or if there are other topics you would want to see or a different format in the workshop, I am really open to feedback. So just send me a message and I promise I'm very nice. So thanks again, and I hope you guys have a great day. Again, this is recorded and will be posted at the end of the day.
Thank you, Cassandra.
Thanks. Have a good one.